So,
oh, that's okay. You can have that back.
Throughout this series on spirituality and spiritual practices, I've asked you, where do you experience God? Right? Some of you might be getting bored with the question. That's okay. But I'm still asking. Where do you experience the healing, life-giving presence of God? Now, this could be a daily encounter, although I suspect for most of us, it won't be. I suspect that we may sense it occasionally. Some of us may feel like we've never sensed it at all. And for those of us who do feel like we sense it occasionally, well, I wonder what form that takes for you. What does that look like? What does it feel like? In what way did you experience the divine? Now, I'm going to ask you to think on this question, to really get deep into this question. I want you to hold on to it for the end of the service, the end of the sermon. I'm not going to ask you to share these answers. I think that it's a fairly private thing. But it will be necessary for the practice we're talking about today. Now, I used to say, the biblical perspective is this, or the biblical perspective is that, and then I learned over time that the biblical perspective is actually greatly wide and varied and not one thing. Can't all be boiled down to some simple answer. In fact, there's 66 different books in the Protestant Bible, and many different authors, and many of them see God differently, as I imagine most or all of you are aware. But when we ask this question, where is God, I do think it's hopeful for us to consider where some of the writers saw God. And when they talk about these things, these become center points for their theology. Where God is, that's where I'm going to build my system around, right? In Genesis, in the first creation story, God rests where? Do any of you remember? On the seventh day, God rests in a temple. God rests in a person. God rests in nature. In the earth that God had created. For some of us, we don't know that creation theology, creation as sacred, is actually ancient. It's ancient amongst the Hebrew people. And this connects in there. God rests in the earth. Now, rest in the ancient religions of the Middle East, well, that's what God's used temples for. So, in this sense, the new, wild earth, with all of its creatures, is God's temple. So where is God? Well, in Pacific Northwest fashion, we can say God is in nature. Right? We can experience God in nature. And I know that's a popular one for a lot of you. I've heard that already since the first Sunday in the series. But this is not how all Hebrew people saw God. After demonstrating mastery over nature, in the Exodus story, God was said to have eventually settled down in a tent. They call it the tabernacle. It was God's home on earth. It was a connection point between earth and heaven, where the community represented by Exodus believes that God also dwelt. So the tabernacle is where God touches down on earth. And it's a tether in that sense. Now this tent traveled with the people as they wandered, and then eventually as they settled down. and it represented God amongst God's people. And it was a wild home. A wild home for a still wild God with a wild and yet scared people. And that makes me wonder, have you ever experienced God and the wild of your life? Have you ever experienced God when you were no longer shackled in some way from societal norms or family or tradition or maybe even aspects of religion? Have you ever experienced God in a time when you felt free? Maybe a season of liberation. Maybe it was a time when there just simply seems to be no prescription for what to do. You were figuring things out as you went. And that also makes me wonder if instead of feeling free, you felt lost. Have you ever met God when you felt lost? Have you ever experienced God in any of these wild spaces? And then the story goes that the wild people of Israel, well, they wanted more order in their life. They chose to have kings, and according to 1 Samuel, this felt deeply shaky because it was such a transition for them. But they wanted to be more civilized. They didn't want to feel so lost, so free. And then the story goes that they became more ordered and more institutionalized in this new founding of a king-led governance. And eventually the kings decided that God needed a palace, not a tent. God needed a fancy temple. Because it didn't seem fair for the kings to have a nice fancy house, and God not to have a nice fancy house. And so King David prepared for the temple to be built, but because he had shed so much blood with his hands, the completion of the temple had to go to his son Solomon. So the dedication of that is the text, first Kings that was read. It's parts of it. I hopped around a little bit. Now it's important to remember that these things are written after the fact. They're not written during the event. This is written during the Babylonian exile. It's looking back. It's kind of a nostalgic text in that way. But it points to the feelings, the experiences that people had of this new structure. It was an impressive building. It was painstakingly crafted to not just hold God's presence on earth, but also to reflect heaven itself. That's a tall order. It was a beautiful piece of art. So I wonder, have you ever encountered God through art? Maybe through architecture. The music scene was platformed at the temple. It's part of why we have so many songs. Have you ever experienced God through music? But it was also, the temple was also the center for a more institutionalized, organized understanding of God. The center of their religion and their daily lives, next to the center of their governments. So this does make me ask, it might seem like a silly question to some of you, given that we are in a church. But have you ever encountered God in an institution? Then, after many years, Babylonians came, and they conquered the Jewish people, and they captured many, they subjugated everybody else. They even destroyed the temple, and with it, the center of their religion. And it's evident from passages like ours how much this mattered to the Jewish captives. Right? Because this is the time period this is written down. They look back at this building with fondness, remembering it as a sign that God lived once upon a time among the people of Israel. But they also looked at it mournfully as they lived so far from their homeland and the temple was in ruins. How were they to make sense of this? Their government was destroyed. Their religious institution was destroyed. And it was thought by many that God had abandoned or even turned on them. So I mentioned some books of Lamentation last week. You want to take a guess when they were written? This is when they were written. This is what they were mourning, what they were trying to come to terms with. This is the struggle that they had a hard time finding a happy conclusion to in these books. And that makes me wonder, you've ever found yourself scrambling to find God when the institutions that you depended on crumbled, failed. Then a new movement arose in which God was worshipped within synagogues. This is a time period where Judaism started to really take shape in a more recognizable, more modernized form. And the people remembered who they were, who they are, and who they could be. Where is God? Well, they would say, with God's people wherever they are, helping them prepare for something better, giving them hope that they can get through this time. Generations later, in the days following their captivity, the experience of God encountered through the synagogue, and then encountered through a new temple, well, those systems would butt heads. God in the institution, God with the people, and this struggle, this argument, conversation continued until Jesus' time, and then shortly after it. In Jesus, the early church saw the temple of God made flesh. Jesus was the temple, they would say. God lived within him. He was earthy, in the Hebrew language, the word for man and woman. Means of the dirt, mud person. And I like that. Adam. So Jesus was earthy, as all humans are. And he was wild. He operated within the system and the institution, while also challenging to reform it. He was called Emmanuel. As we get closer and closer to Advent, anybody remember what Emmanuel means? God with us. So then, have you ever experienced God in Jesus? Have you had that experience? The Gospels and Acts also tell us that Jesus shared God's Spirit amongst his followers. The Spirit of God for the church was no longer restricted to a building or in heaven. The Spirit of God was restricted to a certain people group. It literally filled the people. So let me ask you, have you ever sensed God through another person? You've ever experienced the divine through another person? Maybe it was a special moment of kindness. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was laughter. Maybe it was correction. Maybe it was reconciliation. How about this? Have you ever noticed God within yourself? Have you ever noticed God within you? God's Spirit has been breathed out on all of us. Maybe you grew past that thing you never thought you were going to grow past. Maybe it was healing. Maybe it was simply surviving a very difficult time. Maybe it was unbridled joy and happiness. Maybe it was a far deeper capacity for love and concern for another than you even thought was possible. I don't know. Now my hope is that throughout this week, we invoke our own spirit-mindedness to see God in the places and the people and the seasons we encounter. My hope is that we even, perhaps, have an experience of God amongst people that we don't understand. Maybe even those we have trouble with. Maybe even in ourselves, perhaps especially with ourselves. And with that hope, I have a tool that I want to share with you. Now, in your bulletins, you'll notice a handy half sheet. And it says Heartful Meditation at the top. Now, this is from a book that I read when I was in seminary. It was in a class called Neuroscience and Spirituality. Now, it was so super nerdy. And I loved it. I loved every moment of it. And if you're wondering, well, that's something I want to hear more about, the bodily connection or the neuroscience connection. I'm not going to be able to talk about that with the time we have left. But next week, my sub for Sunday, Chelsea Burlack, is going to talk about embodied spirituality and the ways that our bodies deal with some of what is just stored up in us. Some of you have read The Body Keeps Score, and then touch on some of those concepts. Because we're not just one thing, right? We're not just spirit. We're not just mind. We're not just body. We're an integrated system of all of that. Well, in Heartful Meditation, I found something that has helped me feel grounded in God and less anxious. It can be a real reminder of the beauty and the goodness that's around us. I started utilizing this practice before I knew I was an anxious person. Everybody else knew I did. I remember when I told Stephanie, I think I have anxiety. She's like, did you know that? Well, you did? Yeah. I talked to one of my friends about it. I don't remember being anxious back when I was in college. Like, you don't? No, I was a fun-loving, humorous person. Yeah, you could be those things and still anxious. No, I mean, I was just filled with joy. Do you not remember your dating life? I had conveniently just blocked all of that out. I could have used something like this back when I was dating. It carves out a little moment of calm, a respite. Now the practice has three parts, and you'll notice this on the sheet. Notice, refocus, and nurture. Now I'm not going to talk about all three parts because that's why you got the printout. But I am going to talk about the last one. Now in step 3, we pursue nurture by resting in a life-giving image. Previous weeks I've mentioned this is going to feel a little woo-woo. Okay? Just try it out, even if you're woo-woo averse. So we think of a life-giving image and we rest in that. And this is where the question I asked at the beginning of the sermon would be handy. You can think of that space that you can encounter God within and just spend time in that. Now, you might want an example, because this is just so very abstract. Well, I used to live in Hawaii. That is where I came to live with my mom and my stepdad. Came out of a very difficult home situation, came into a very healthy, good home situation. And for 3 years, Hawaii was home. And we'd go to the beach all the time. There was one beach in particular that was my family spot. I mean, we shared it with thousands of people because it's Hawaii, and we lived on Oahu. But it was our beach. And that was Bellows Beach. Passed by monkeys who would run through the little forest section right before it. There's a little piece of rock that jutted out into the ocean. Sea turtles would come in. Sometimes Portuguese man o' war would come in. That's a type of jellyfish. They get 75 to 100 foot long tentacles. So I have many memories of that. Now those aren't the ones I would rest in when I was think of a life-giving image. For me, it would be when I would just lay on the sand, content, feeling whole with my family, safe. I close my eyes, and I would remember the smell of the salty sea air, and the feel of the sand on my body, and a little bit of moisture coming out of the ocean, and the warm sun, and the clamor of the people all around me. And that was safety. And that was love. And that was God, even though I didn't really have the language for it at the time. And so when I do heartfulness meditation, starting off, that's the image I would rest in. I would spend some time preparing for that, doing some of the exercises we talked about in previous weeks, like breathing, for example. And then I would just spend time here, remembering in my body what it felt like to feel safe. Eventually that image changed. For me, it became something a bit more metaphorical. I'll get into that one-on-one if you want to hear what it is. I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful that even while I'm dealing with sickness, sick kids, and a teething little girl, and stress, I love my job so much. But there's a little bit of stress. I can carve out a little bit of calm, right? Now, you may have a different image that comes to your minds. Maybe you'll conjure up or you're just sitting next to a friend silently at a park on a log. Maybe it's that moment before a concert starts that you really want to be at. We all have our different sacred experiences from our past. We can call those to mind. Sometimes the ancients would put rocks in a certain spot. That Ebenezer concept comes from there. Here I raise my Ebenezer. Well, it's a spot of remembrance. There was a sacred encounter that happened here. Jacob's well is a special place. Why? Because Jacob encountered God there. Things like that. And this is a way to do that same thing. Now, every one of us, imperfect as we are a temple of God. And some of us may, in some seasons, look more pristine. This would be easier if my collar wasn't all out of whack. Some of us, our curtains have been pressed, and our incense is the best kind of fragrance for me that we lavender. Others of us, though, our temples have suffered great damage. We've been ransacked. Someone has stolen our precious ornaments. They've vandalized our walls. Some of us may even have the blood of the innocent on our sacred ground. And yet, we are still temples of God. We have not been abandoned. The divine is present with us. and we continue on. We
We
are the home of God on earth, and no one can take that away from us. No one can take that away from you.
And
And likewise, when this life is over, and our temples crash into the earth, the God that we have been home to, is my conviction, is then home for us.